I guess that many of your opponents will decline the Morra out of sheer terror, but it's a case of out of the frying pan into the fire. White usually gets his initiative and doesn't even have to sacrifice to get it. On this particular video, I'll be analysing lines of the Morra Gambit declined. That's to say variations where black doesn't snap off the second gambit pawn on c3. Now by far the most important of these lines is 3 knight f6, and I'll be giving that extensive coverage. I'm going to recommend the line e5, knight d5, queen takes d4 for white. Underrated by theory, and I think it gives white good chances. We'll see this in detail. In the second section, we'll be going on to consider the important move 3d5. Black thinks he's going back into a main line of the c3 Sicilian, but in fact, by taking on d4 so early, and this is why the Morra move order is so important, in fact, we've closed down a lot of black's options. I'll be demonstrating that white can get the advantage however black plays in this line. We'll then go on to consider the other important moves for black in this position, namely 3d3, where black bottles out, gives white back the pawn back straight away. I don't think white should have any bother after c4 in maintaining at least a slight edge, and we'll look at that later. And we'll also consider the move 3g6, a favourite of American Grandmaster Roman Zinzikashvili, where I'll be recommending a little known and very dangerous plan to you. Finally, I'll be looking at the awful moves which some patzers just might play, namely e5 and queen a5. Amazingly, a Grandmaster has actually played this move. I'll be showing you the refutation a little later on. Let's get moving then with the knight f6 variation. We'll assume that white is playing the Morra Gambit move order and that black takes on d4 and white goes c3. Now many players here will go knight f6 against you because they don't feel particularly confident about accepting your dangerous gambit. Against this line you should definitely push on. It's worthwhile moving the black knight around to try and gain a bit of time. Black goes knight d5, and I'm going to recommend the queen takes d4 variation. Now what are the ideas of this line? Well, firstly, black has to look after his knight in the centre. White uses the time gained to develop his pieces and fortify the e5 pawn. White is hoping that that pawn, backed up by queen and possibly the knight on f3, will prove awkward for black. Normally black plays e6 here, and then we'll look at knight f3 as our main move. Now by far the most common move for black here is knight c6. I mean, that is a logical move, wouldn't you agree? Just attacking the white queen, gaining a tempo. But before we start our examination of that, I want briefly to look at the move 6b6, which has been seen in a handful of games. Against b6, which is not a bad move in its own right, I'm going to recommend knight bd2, the idea of which is knight c4, gripping the d6 square. And we'll follow a part of the game Bajevic versus Nikolic Yugoslav Championship 1990. There black played bishop b7 and white played knight c4, which is the main idea against this line. Knight c6 was played, and then instead of the usual placement for the queen in this line, queen e4, Bajevic played an excellent move, queen to g4. He figures, because both white knights defend the e5 pawn, that he doesn't need his queen to protect it anymore, so he puts the queen in an aggressive kingside position. Nikolic played queen c7, and now Chandler thinks instead of knight d6, as Bajevic played, which looks okay by the way, both bishop d3 and queen g3 give black some problems with natural development. For instance, black's got a big problem as to what he does with the bishop on f8. It can't move at the moment. White is probably threatening just simply to go knight d6 check, which is very disruptive, and black might try castling long in this position, but then white's got a ready-made attack with a simple a4. All in all, after queen g3 or bishop d3, I assess white's chances as clearly better. Perhaps that's why 6b6 hasn't been seen more often. Let's move on now to examine the move 6 knight c6. I mean, that is what the bulk of your opponents will play. And the best move for white here is certainly Queen e4, playing the queen to a nice central square and reinforcing the e5 pawn. Now black has quite a few moves here, and we'll look at each in turn. Lots of your opponents are going to play the move d6. It's quite a natural idea, seems to free up the black position. But I'm going to recommend a very modern idea of Grandmaster Stein from Germany, which I think messes up black's position. To kick off with, white plays bishop b5 here. That's not very common. And in the bulk of the games that I've seen with bishop b5, black is going bishop d7. Now if we just take that move back, what happens if black takes on e5? Well, then simply knight takes e5 is a good move, and that will either mess up black's pawn structure, or black will have to surrender the two bishops after bishop d7. So with the queenside pawn majority and the two bishops, it's possible that white has such a clear advantage that black is unwilling to go into this line. So bishop d7, and now Stein's idea is to go c4 in this position. A forcing move, attacking the knight and giving black a wide but unappetising choice. Black has three decent moves in this position. He can either go to b4, b6 or c7. In the game Ratku vs Benderach, World Junior Under-20 Championships 1996, black played knight b4. But in my view this is the least good of the choices available to black. Black's idea was that after the natural a3 he wanted to play d5, but only misery followed. White played queen e2, and black continued to play intermezzos by playing a6. After bishop a4, b5, c takes b5, a takes b5, bishop takes b5, black tried queen a5, outright tactics, but white was not to be confused. He simply castled. Black then went knight takes e5, as if that justified the idea, but now a very good move by white, a takes b4, leaving a myriad of pieces en prise. Knight takes f3 check was played, and now another excellent move by white, g takes f3. Well, black didn't see any future in mucking around in this position. He virtually has to go for it. He played queen takes a1. But then it's not surprising that after bishop takes d7 check, white was able to subject the black king to a withering attack. King takes d7 was the move, and white went queen b5 check, and the black queen's stranded down there at the ends of the earth, of course. King went to e7, and now a very interesting move, knight a3. Just cutting that queen right out of the game and threatening the vicious bishop g5 check, which would actually win the queen. Black tried rook takes a3, hoping that white would play bishop g5 check in this position, when black would try and muddle through with two rooks for the queen, but white wasn't having any of that. He simply played b takes a3. And now, on top of the black king being stuck in the middle, white's got two passed pawns on the queen side. It's not surprising this miserable position was wrapped up very quickly by white. Black tried f6 to give his king a flight square. White played queen b7 check, king e8, and then bishop e3 was the move, just introducing the reserves into the attack. Black went queen a2, rook c1, bishop e7, and then the simple concluding stroke was queen c8 check. After bishop d8, or else black loses his rook, queen takes e6 check, black resigned. The simple conclusion must be from this game that knight db4 is tactically inferior. Back now to the position after 9c4, and let's examine knight c7 now by black. The only merit of which I can see is that it might attack the white bishop. We'll look at two interesting games now, or fragments from them. Stein versus Kuatli, Grandmaster, Lugano Open 1982, and B. Stein versus Plachetka, Copenhagen Open 1990. In both games, white should have achieved a big advantage. E takes d6 was the move played in both. Bishop takes d6, and now Stein's idea is castles. Now in Stein Plachetka, black couldn't resist it. He snapped off white's bishop. The trouble with that move is that after c takes b5, it gives white a definite initiative. Black played knight e7, and then instead of queen takes b7, as Stein played, which of course is well playable, they thought after the game that knight c3 was a better move. And then Grandmaster Plachetka gives the following line. According to him, black should play queen c7 in this position, and then white should play rook d1. He gives castles by black. I guess that's the move that has to be played. And now queen d3 is a very interesting idea by white, which seems to win a bishop. Black can bail out here by going knight d5. If he goes knight f5, then I think white just plays g4. That seems to win a piece as far as I can see. So he gives knight d5, knight takes d5, e takes d5, and now queen takes d5 is the move given by Plachetka, when black is supposed to play bishop e6 with an unclear position. The point of this move is that if white now takes the bishop on d6, black can play rook a d8, and then white's got a back rank problem. However, I think white can do a little bit better in that line, and I'll show you how. He should certainly take the pawn on d5. I mean, if a guy offers you a pawn, why not take it? But after bishop e6, it's folly to take the bishop on d6. What in fact white should play in this position is queen h5. When as far as I can see, he's a pawn up. He threatens the move knight g5. If black finds a way of stopping that, simple development will do. Just bishop e3 and rook ac1. I don't see any real compensation for black in this position for being a pawn down, so it must be advantageous to white. Back then to the position after knight c7, and you'll recall white should take on d6, bishop takes d6, castles. Well, in Stein-Coatley, Lugano Open 1982, black wasn't tempted to take that bishop. He played a6, hoping that after bishop a4, b5, he would actually gain the initiative on the queen side. White played bishop b3, and black played knight a5. And now Stein played a move which seems to be an integral part of this whole variation, rook to d1, exploiting the pile-up of black pieces on the d-file. Coatley played b takes c4, rook takes d6, c takes b3. But now knight e5 turned out rather well for white. Black went knight d5, rook takes d7, queen c8, hoping to cause confusion by view of the twin threats queen takes c1, which leads to mate, and f6, exploiting the slightly hanging nature of the white pieces. But white found an elegant way to get out of his difficulties. He played knight a3. The point of this is that if black now plays f6, I think white can simply play rook takes g7, giving back the piece, so that after f takes e5, he simply plays queen takes e5, and black's position is all over the place. So the conclusion must be that after 18 knight a3, black is in fact lost in this position, because Coatley couldn't find anything better than the miserable move, castles. Having said that, Stein decided the game in a beautiful way. He played 19 bishop h6, a superb move. Black played knight f6 here, but we should see what happens if he takes the bishop. After 19 g takes h6, white plays queen g4 check, which leads to big trouble after king h8, knight takes f7 check. Rook takes f7, rook takes f7, and black's game is in ruins. So knight f6 was played by Coatley, and now came another excellent move, 20 queen f4. That's very good indeed. The point of this move is that if black now plays knight takes d7, queen g5 is the reply. When after g6, knight takes d7, white is not only recouping all that he gave away, he's threatening queen f6 and the rook on f8 twice. Black has no escape from this devastating attack. After queen f4 then, black endeavoured to get his knight back from the edge with knight c6. Of course this is not sufficient. 21 queen g5 was the move, again forcing black's hand. Knight e8 was played, and then Stein just played the calm move, 22 knight ac4. Black traded knights on e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and then tried his very last trick with b takes a2. With white's pieces in such dominating positions, it's not really surprising that any trick doesn't work here. White just played rook e7, maintaining his attack. Of course black can't play f6 at any stage because g7 is just en prise. So black tried queen c2, this really is the last chance. White played very calmly once more, h3. Queen b1 check was played, and now just simply king h2. The problem is for black that if he plays queen takes a1 here, white's threat of rook takes e8 is just a crusher. That would lead to mate. Coatley therefore played queen f5, but rook takes e8 was devastating. Queen takes g5, rook takes f8 check, king takes f8, bishop takes g5, f6, knight d7 check. Finally, black resigned. A very convincing win by white. Back now to what should probably be black's best choice in this position, knight b6. It's a move, however, which I still think leads to an advantage for white. White should take on d6 in this position. And after bishop d6, play in the same manner as the last line with castles, threatening knight c3 and rook d1 with a coherent development. According to the theory of this position, black plays a6 here, and then rook d1 is the nice intermezzo. Queen c7 is usually played, and now knight c3 has been played in 3 games of Stein, all of which have led to an advantage for white. In the first of these, Stein versus Bebchuk, Dortmund 1993, black castled in this position. And white continued to bemuse black with tactics by playing bishop e3. The point of this is that if a takes b5, white can choose between knight takes b5, which is excellent, or bishop takes b6, exploiting the unfortunate pile-up of black pieces on the d file. That seems to be a key idea of this line, white playing rook d1 exploiting that pile-up. Bebchuk played knight c8, but then came a further intermezzo, c5. White seems determined to leave that bishop en prise as long as possible. Bishop e7 was played, and now further intermezzo, bishop f4. A surprised Bebchuk played queen a5, but after rook takes d7, penetrating black's position, a takes b5, rook takes b7, white had a clear advantage and went on to win. Back now to the position after knight c3, and we'll see another demonstration why castles is not such a good move for black, from the game De La Villa Garcia, Sion Castro, Zaragoza Open 1995, where white again played the move bishop e3. After knight c8, c5, Sion Castro tried the tactical move bishop takes h2 check. This didn't worry white too much, he took with the knight. Black took white's bishop on b5, but knight takes b5 was the easy reply. Queen a5 was played by Sion Castro, and white played a4. He could have taken on d7, but preferred to reinforce the strong knight. Black played bishop e8, pretty horrible move to have to play. Knight g4 was played, and black played queen b4. Queen takes b4, knight takes b4, and now knight c7 was an excellent move. And I think black had been so disrupted by white's unusual opening that he made a losing mistake in this position. But of course white still has a massive advantage here. Rook takes a4 was Sion Castro's unfortunate move. Can you see the refutation? Perhaps you should stop a minute to look for it. Or did you see rook takes a4, bishop takes a4, rook d4? If you did, you played the same way as De La Villa Garcia, and in this position black is losing a piece. He resigned. Back we go to the position after knight c3 then. And a final example I want to show you features the game Stein versus Birmingham, Hamburg 1986, where black played knight e5 in this position. Knight takes e5 is definitely the move. Bishop takes e5. And now the excellent move c5 here, purely tactical. In Stein Birmingham, black played bishop takes b5. But then white revealed his point with c takes b6. Bishop takes h2 check was played. King went to h1. And black played queen e5, the only decent move to keep his bishop protected. But after queen h4, very simply, black was losing a piece again and had to resign. In case you were baffled by some of the tactics in that game, let's just drop back to the position after c5 as played by white. First question you should have asked yourself is what happens after queen takes c5 by black? Well, that's not really a very good move because white plays bishop e3 and suddenly all of black's pieces are on pre. It's very difficult for black to get them all off pre in this position. He's actually going to lose something, so that move would actually win for white. A further move, a takes b5, was actually played in the game Stein versus Grandmaster Skembris, Dortmund 1990. And white played c takes b6, when in order to protect his bishop, keep this one on e5 protected, black had to play the crazy move queen b8. And there are three moves in this position which I believe give white the advantage. The first of these is a simple move h3. White should be better in this position simply because black can't castle. If black plays bishop to c6, then I think queen b4 is a good move, keeping the black king in the middle. So that's the first try for white, which might be good. Secondly, and this was a move suggested by Murray Chandler in his book The Complete C3 Sicilian, Chandler recommends the move g3, presumably just to put the blot on the bishop, with the same idea. If black plays bishop c6, as he probably must actually, white can go queen b4, locking the black king in the middle. I suppose queen g4 is another option, but I think I prefer queen b4. And as a third move, the move that actually Stein played against Skembris, queen b4 immediately. But of course that allowed Skembris to take on h2, as he did. And it might be worth just following this game for a little while to see how white, even there, built up an advantage. Well, king h1 looked forced, and now Skembris played very aggressively queen e5. White went queen h4, seemingly winning a piece, but Skembris tried to escape with b4. Knight e4 was played, and you would bet your house on this position turning out favourably for white. Black played bishop c6. Knight d6 check was played, and now black has to surrender his queen, otherwise he just simply loses the bishop on h2. So the game careered on. Queen takes d6, rook takes d6, bishop takes d6, bishop f4, bishop e7, queen g3, black castled, and then bishop e5 was played. g6, bishop d6, bishop takes d6, queen takes d6. And this position is evaluated differently by two separate grandmasters. According to Murray Chandler, black is okay in this position with rook, bishop and pawn for the queen. But Grandmaster Haas V, a young brilliant attacking grandmaster from Israel, thinks that white is slightly better. I tend to side more towards Haas V's assessment than Chandler. For instance, black is losing that pawn on b4, come what may. He's either going to lose it on b4 or b3. And when white captures that pawn, I just believe that white has slightly the better chances in view of his ability to push those queenside pawns up the board. Coming back now to the position after 7 queen e4, and in some senses the critical position. Instead of d6, black may try f5, and I guess that's the main line of this system. This is what black plays most often. Against that move, I think white should leave his pawn on e5 and play queen to e2. And the first line I want to consider is the line where black plays queen to c7 here. Against this, white should play g3. And now there are 3 separate branches for black. The first of these, and in some sense the most critical, is b6, the counter fianchetto. It's particularly appropriate because Joe Gallagher mentioned this move in his Beating the Anti-Sicilians as the best way for black to play. What he didn't mention, of course, was the move 10 knight bd2. Little known, little used, but which looks quite good for white against b6. There's only one important game that I could find with knight bd2, and that was the game Rogers versus Haas V, 2 grandmasters, from the Beale 1992 tournament. Let's see what happened. In that game, black lashed out with the move g5. He needn't do this, but in some senses this is a critical move because it forces white to take on g5, and then black breaks up white's grip on the d6 square. Rogers took the pawn and Haas V played queen takes e5. Then came knight c4, queen takes e2, check, bishop takes e2. Now while this position doesn't look like much for white, it must be remembered that white is threatening the killer move bishop h5 check here, very disruptive. And also his knight on c4 is quite well placed. All in all, I assess white as slightly better in this position, and the continuation of the game suggests that this is in fact the case. Haas V hurried to get rid of white's knight with b5, and Rogers went knight e3. Knight takes e3, bishop takes e3, and suddenly white's position was more together than black's. The problem for black here is that his b5 pawn is on pre. Haas V tried b4. I guess if he'd played a6, white's continuation would have been the same. But then bishop h5 check was strong. After king e7, knight f7, rook g8, bishop g5 check, black was forced to surrender the exchange for nebulous compensation. And after rook takes g5, knight takes g5, white was clearly in the ascendancy. Back to the position after knight bd2 now, and you might have wondered why g5 was such a good move for black. I mean, shouldn't black be playing more naturally in this position? Well, I think that after a move like d6, for instance, white can still maintain the advantage by natural means. A simple way would be to take on d6, and after bishop takes d6, go knight c4. After all, that is the point of knight bd2. If black wants to surrender the 2 bishops, he can castle, but then bishop g2 or knight takes e6 leads to a small advantage for white. Thus I consider bishop e7 to be the best move here, and now bishop g5 gives white a slight edge. If white can take away black's dark squared bishop, he can look forward to penetration on the e5 and d6 squares. Please note that after bishop takes g5, knight takes g5, e5, white can castle on the queen side, quite unusual, with pressure. Before we leave the variation with b6, it's worth pointing out why white doesn't play bishop g2 in this position. Black actually has a strong move here, and that is knight cb4, with the awkward threat of bishop a6. It's not that white can't meet this move, he can actually play some moves to counter this plan, but all in all I think it's best to avoid such tactical continuations. Play it simple with knight bd2, the rare continuation, and you'll get a good game. Moving back to the position after knight g3 now, where white is threatening to build a strong stable game by playing bishop g2 and castles. Black often tries the move d6 to try and break up white's grip. Against that, I recommend a small refinement in move order. First you take on d6. Black recaptures with the bishop, then you play simply the bishop g2, and now black castles. When I recommend not castles for white, which would be the natural move, but a slight refinement in move order, 12 knight bd2. The knight's heading for c4 in order to fight for control of the e5 square and the dark squares in general. I think white should play this move before he castles, and I'll show you why. Let's assume black plays knight f6 in this position. The reason he does this is that the move he wants to play, of course, is e5. But then I think queen c4 makes life a little bit awkward for black. That pin really messes black's game up. That's why black should retreat his knight to f6. After that comes knight c4, and black plays e5. I think you'll agree with me that these moves are plausible. Now comes knight takes d6, relieving black of the two bishops. Queen takes d6. And now the star move here, which gives white the advantage, is knight g5. Timing is very important in this variation. Now that move contains a simple threat of queen c4 check, which will win the exchange. So black has to deal with that. I analyse three continuations. In the first line, black tries to put the blot on white's bishop at g2 with e4. Then white should play queen c4 check, king h8, and not knight f7, because then I think after that move black plays rook takes f7, queen takes f7, knight e5, when the counter-attack could be dangerous. I don't think we want to allow that, do we? So white's best move in this position, instead of knight f7, is bishop f4. Now that limits black's choices. The best move for black is surely queen e7. If queen d7, then rook d1 accelerates white's pressure. But after queen e7, white castles on the queen side with a much better game. White threatens bishop d6, and he controls all the relevant squares. Going back to the position after knight g5, black sets a trap in the next variation with knight e7. The idea is to trap white's queen if white's tempted after queen c4 check, king h8, to go knight f7. I'll just show you the queen trap. White should avoid this move. Queen takes, f7, and then bishop e6. Watch out for that one. The best move for white in this position is the preparatory bishop e3, setting a trap of white's own. The point is that knight f7 is still threatened, and black has a really hard task getting out of it. Rook d1 is prepared, and if black plays h6 here with the same intention of trapping white's queen, then I think white can go in and take the exchange. For instance, knight f7 check, rook takes f7, queen takes f7, bishop e6, and now the killer blow, bishop c5, securing the white queen's escape. So after bishop e3, I think white is in the ascendancy. Back now to the position after knight g5. Black's third try to defend is knight d8. That looks passive, but black is holding the f7 and e6 squares. White should again play queen c4 check, and now black has three choices. If he goes king h8, then bishop e3 is a simple reply, threatening rook d1, when white is simply better. If he goes bishop e6, white simply lops that off with the bishop pair and b7 hanging. Thus after queen c4 check, it appears that the uncomfortable knight e6 is forced. After bishop e3, king h8 would appear to be forced. But then I recommend rook d1, Queen e7. If Queen c7, white takes on c7 and plays bishop c5, which is very strong. So Queen e7 is forced, and now comes knight takes e6, bishop takes e6, Queen b5, and white has a very good position. There are vulnerable black pawns to attack. He threatens bishop c5, and white has the bishop pair in an open position, as well as control of the d file. And on top of all that, the queenside majority is another trump in white's hand. It appears that if black plays a d6 variation, if you remember to put your knight on d2 before castling, you can look forward to the advantage. Back to the position after 9g3 now. And the third and final move I want to examine for black here is knight de7. Now the idea of this move is to make life as awkward as possible for white to get castled. For instance, if white were to play bishop g2 here, black goes knight g6. And this will force bishop f4 out of white, perhaps a little too soon. Maybe white doesn't want to play that move at this juncture. So white's got to be on the ball after knight d7, but if he plays knight a3, which I think is the most accurate move, then I believe he can look forward to a good game. Well, in view of the threats of knight b5 and or knight c4, black must play knight g6, and then we're going knight b5 anyway, which more or less forces queen b8. The whole point of black's system is to keep an eye on that e-pawn, so queen b8 is consistent. Then white must play bishop f4 in order to keep his pawn. And in all the games I've seen with this system, black usually plays a6 to get rid of white's pesky knight. I guess if black didn't do that, white was threatening rook d1 and then he comes into d6. So black gets rid of the knight. Knight b d4. Knight takes d4. Knight takes d4 by white. And now I'll give you three separate examples of play at a high level where white got the advantage. The first fragment of a game I want to show you is between Rosentalis, grandmaster from Lithuania, and Asmaiprashvili, another grandmaster. And this was played in Vilnius 1984. It's an old game but very instructive. And in that game black played b6. He's got to do something with that bishop. Bishop g2 happened. Bishop b7. Bishop takes b7. Queen takes b7. And now, interestingly, white castled on the queen side. The point of this variation seems to be to put pressure on the d file, and it doesn't seem very easy for black to mount pressure against the white king. I mean, the king is well covered in this position. Sure enough, white's pressure in the d file did lead eventually to an advantage. Bishop e7 was played by Asmaiprashvili, and white played h4. h5 happened. Black took on f4. G takes f4. And now b5. Well, probably Asmaiprashvili didn't see any other way to create counterplay against this position. But now comes a very good move by white. White played rook h3. Not only does that defend laterally the queen side advance by black, but it also threatens rook hd3, accelerating the pressure. Asmaiprashvili tried rook a c8, but after knight c2, rook f7, rook hd3, black had been pushed onto the defensive. I assess this position as at least slightly better for white, who went on to win in 63 moves. Back to the position after knight d7, and let's run through that move order again. White plays knight a3, threatening knight b5. Black knight g6, knight b5 anyway, queen b8. Bishop f4, a6. White was threatening rook d1. Knight bd4, knight takes d4. Knight takes d4. And now in Rosentalis Sterua, USSR Under-20 Championship, 1984, black tried b5 instead of b6. Bishop g2, bishop b7, bishop takes b7, Queen takes b7, and again white castled on the queen side. Now this time white's got to be a bit more careful, because as you can see black has played b5 in one go in place of b6. So a little bit of consolidation on the queen side is necessary before white accelerates his own pressure down the d file. Accordingly, after rook c8, Rosenthalis played king b1. Black played bishop c5, white knight b3, bishop e7, and now f3 was played by white. Now that might look a peculiar move, but the idea that was played against Asmaiprashvili is the same. White wants to create pressure down the d file, and white played rook d3 in this position. Black played rook c7, rook h-d1, so it's the same sort of thing. Black played b4, but after 23 bishop d2, white's pressure down the d file was more meaningful than black's potential queenside attack. White went on to win this game in 37 moves. Now coming back to the position after g3 and knight de7 by black, I can imagine some of you might not be enamoured by castling on the queen side and subjected yourself to a strong black attack, even though that hasn't been proven by analysis. So here's an alternative plan for you where white castles short. And I'm going to show you the game Bricard versus Koch, two strong international masters. And this game comes from the 1992 French Championship. For a while we follow the other games. White plays the key move knight a3, knight g6, knight b5, and now queen drops back to b8. Now bishop f4, shoring up the e pawn, a6, because black doesn't want the hassle of white playing rook d1, knight b d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, and now here comes that b5 move, accelerating black's potential attack on the queen side. Well, in Bricard Koch, white played bishop g2, bishop b7, and now he castled short. So that's a slightly different approach for you. White's king is probably a little bit more secure in this line. Black played bishop c5 and white knight b3. Bishop b6 happened, and now rook fd1. So Bricard's obviously got the same idea as Rosenthalis before him. He wants to put pressure down that d file onto d7. Koch played bishop takes g2. If nothing else, this does allow black to reintroduce his queen into the game. Rook a7, trying to shore up the d7 pawn. But now key move by white, a4, and that creates pressure on the b5 pawn. B takes a4, rook takes a4, black played bishop c7, and now came rook b4. And in this position I think we can definitely state that white holds the edge. Black's pawn on a6 is weak. Black still hasn't solved the problem of his pawn on d7, and after queen a8 check, king g1, white's king is safe and he retains numerous positional trumps. Bricard went on to comfortably win this game in 38 moves, and black never got to break that grip on d6. Moving back now to the position before black's 7th move, and black will play f5, white queen e2, and we'll now look at the 8th move alternative to black, apart from queen c7. The first of these is the logical move b6. White should play g3, as he's been traditionally doing, and when black plays bishop b7, white just simply plays bishop g2. Now I believe this position is superior for white due to the cramping effect of the e5 pawn. And as evidence I'm going to append the game Ian Rogers versus Greg Canfell, Melbourne Open 1998. Black basically played natural moves in that game and got beaten up. Canfell played bishop e7 and both sides castled. Then Rogers played rook to d1, so the theme of the d-file pressure seems to be all over this variation. It's inescapable. And black played queen e8. Now that looks like a pseudo-active move to me. If black brings his queen out to h5, then perhaps he does manage to drum up some kingside pressure, but white's job is not to allow him that time. Accordingly, Rogers played c4. and that's a rather good move. The point of this, of course, is that when black's knight moves, he can't then move his queen because he's tied down to the defence of d7. So a very good move. And of course knight b4 will be simply met by a3. That's just a loss of time as far as I can see. So the knight has to grovel back to a most unfortunate square, knight c7. This allowed Rogers time to build up with a simple move knight c3, and now we can see white's advantage crystallising. He's managing to put all his pieces on excellent squares. Rook d8 was black's natural move. Okay, he wants to move his queen out to h5 if he's allowed. White played bishop f4, nailing down that pawn on d7. h6, h4, and queen h5. So black is playing very logically. He's trying to get the move g5 in to start a kingside attack. Rogers ignored that and played a3. Now the point of that move is that black can't play g5 in this position, because if he does, white takes, black takes back, and then I think just knight takes g5. Wins a pawn, because black's queen is undefended. So with Camfell unable to play the move he's been preparing for some time, he's reduced to making a horrible defensive move. And he came up with bishop a8. I don't really understand that move. Possibly he couldn't find anything else to do. At any rate, Rogers advanced on him. b4. a6 was played. I think we can definitely say this position is clearly better for white. Black's queenside pawns are weak, and a possible plan by white could be rook a2 and then rook d2, with simple direct pressure against d7. Rogers went on to easily win this game in 29 moves. Again, black failed to break the grip on d6. In the game Sauray vs Johnston, 4NCL 1997, the following variation was played. Bishop e7. A natural enough move, but do natural moves help black in this position? White played g3, black castled, so it's a traditional setup with bishop g2, and black continues to make Sicilian moves, bishop b7. And now Sauray played c4. Well, this move coupled with the move rook d1 seem to be thematic in this variation. Black must try and avoid the d7 pawn being nailed down. Correspondingly, white will try and nail that pawn down. If he achieves that, he seems to get the edge, whatever black plays. Well, Johnston played knight c7, but that is a rather passive square for the knight. Now knight c3 came, h6, b3, queen e8, bishop b2, rook d8. With rook a d1, he could have left black without anything to do in this position, with the traditional pressure. Instead, he played 16 a3 and went on to win in 29 easy moves. Returning to the position once more after black plays f5 and white queen e2. What happens if black tries to break white's grip immediately with the move d6? What should white play against that? Well, I think he should play g3 here, when black's best is certainly to go into other lines already examined after, for instance, queen c7. If he doesn't and takes on e5 in this position, then I think white gets a clear advantage. And we'll look at a fragment of the game Jacobs versus Stoutenborough, Hollywood, 1973 to show why. This is a very rare variation. Knight takes e5 is played by white, already threatening queen h5 check. Black should trade, knight takes e5, queen takes e5. But the upshot of all this is that white's queen has been allowed to come into a very dominating position. Queen d6 was played by Stoutenborough, and white played queen e2. Now the best move in this position is certainly bishop e7. But I think after bishop g2, castles, bishop f6, knight a3, white keeps the advantage. It's very important that black is not able to play e5 in this position, because if he does, knight b5 gives him big problems. White will take on d5 and fork with knight c7. Stoutenborough played bishop d7, the idea of which was to play after bishop g2, bishop c6, castles, rook d8, but after the simple rook e1, black was in trouble. White has domination of e5 and pressure against e6. Stoutenburg tried king f7, which is a pretty miserable move, but then knight a3 was the excellent reply. Rook e8 came, knight c4, queen c7, and white went knight e5 with an overwhelming position. Going back to the position after 7 queen e4 now, the final line I'll look at is the rare move queen c7 by black, where he tries to trick white into a funny move order. Against queen c7 I recommend knight bd2, an idea of Russian master Vorotnikov, with the following variations. In the game Zaitsev versus Menzel, St Petersburg Open 1992, black tried knight de7. White played knight c4, knight g6, and then h4, trying immediately to exploit the unfortunate position of black's knight. And now f5, that's the reason black plays queen c7. He's trying to find a different moment, the right moment to play f5 and drive white's queen back. But in Zaitsev versus Menzel, white played queen e3, slightly different placement of the queen this time. He's not committed to playing queen e2 in this line. Bishop e7 happened, and now h5. Embarrassing that knight. Knight dropped back to f8, and white went knight d4. The same sort of theme applies here. Look at that d6 square. White is trying to nail down d6. Knight takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop c5 by black, queen f4, and suddenly if you examine this position you'll see that natural development has been denied to black in view of white's d6 grip. It's very difficult to see a coherent form of developing for black. Where's he going to put his pieces in this line? Well, Menzel played rook g8. That's a weird looking move, but the idea is he wants to go g5 and get rid of white's well placed queen. Bishop e3 was the excellent reply, gaining a move. Of course black can't really entertain the exchange of dark square bishops here because that would leave d6 very, very weak. So bishop e7 happened, and now castles on the queen side. And here I think white has a clear advantage. He's got that d-file grip once more. There's no black attack to be seen on the queen side, and white will power home with knight d6 check at the right moment. A very important third move alternative for black in this position is 3d5. Although in my opinion it's not the world's greatest move. The reason is that after e takes d5, queen takes d5, c takes d4, black has transposed directly back into a c3 Sicilian but denied himself a number of important options by taking on d4 straight away. In my opinion, however black plays in this system, white should be able to work up at least a slight edge. In the first part of this section, I'll consider systems where black goes for an early e5. And obviously the earliest moment he can play e5 is right away. e5 now. After this, I recommend the following procedure for white. White should certainly play knight f3 in this position. Now if black wants to strike out on an independent course here, the only way he can do this is to go e takes d4. But now we follow some old analysis of Gligorich and Sokolov where white gets the better position. Here white should exchange queens with queen takes d4. The idea of this move is that black has no real alternative other than to exchange the queens, and after queen takes, knight takes, white has a very powerful centralised knight which it's difficult to get rid of. In particular, white might be threatening knight b5, so the mainline move here is a6. After that, I believe white's best procedure is knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, with a significant advantage in development. A typical follow-up might be bishop c4 and castles on the king side, with ongoing pressure. Going back to the position after knight takes d4, what happens if black omits the move a6? Well, in Kvetkovic Sokolov, Belgrade, 1954, black played knight f6. But after bishop b5 check, bishop d7, castles, white was already beginning to make black regret his omission of a6. There's an immediate threat of rook e1 check, which is quite embarrassing for black to meet, in view of his retarded development. Sokolov tried knight c6, but after rook e1 check, bishop e7, bishop takes c6, a move which enables white to keep his centralised knight, b takes c6, knight c3, knight d5, knight takes d5, c takes d5. After bishop f4, black was unable to get castled, and thus white retained a huge advantage. It seems that black must play a6 on move 8. We move on now to discuss black's most important e5 break, and it's doubly important because this was a line recommended by Joe Gallagher in his Beating the Anti-Sicilians book. I'm talking about the variation. After black plays a knight c6, white plays knight f3, and black goes straight through with the move e5. This is probably the most important line in the whole 3d5 complex. Against this, white should play the natural move knight c3, and then comes bishop b4. Obviously, if the black queen were to move, then white would just gain a colossal amount of time by playing d5, for instance. White plays bishop d2 here. Bishop takes c3 is black's idea, surrendering the two bishops. This is very important. Very important in this position because black would not like to play e takes d4 here, opening up the game for white's bishops. And normally black plays e4, with white bringing his knight into e5. Black takes the knight, d takes e5, and now knight e7. Well, Gallagher's idea is that this is a very solid line for black. Black follows up with either bishop e6 or bishop f5, and the position is simplified, rather drawish. He says if black wants to make a quick draw or tempt white into overextending, this is a good line to play. Well, if an openings expert such as Joe Gallagher recommends it, it must be a difficult line to crack. But I'm going to recommend a 12th move which is slightly unusual, but nevertheless I believe to be quite good for white, and that is 12 queen e2. Now that's a strange looking move, blocking in white's bishop on f1. But the idea is to play rook d1 as quickly as possible. White is not too unhappy if black takes the a pawn and trades it off for the e pawn, then the game would open up in favour of the two bishops. Now after queen e2 in practice, black has castled, and that is indeed the move recommended by Gallagher in the book. White plays rook d1, and then there are two moves for black. Unfortunately, queen takes a2 doesn't seem to be particularly good for black, and Gallagher doesn't recommend this move, he just mentions that it's bad. I'll try to show you what white should play against this line. He should certainly play bishop b4, uncomfortably pinning the black knight, which forces queen e6, and it seems that white is better here after the simple queen takes e4, rook e8, and then either bishop d3, as played in the game Kastner versus Galandawa, Czech Championship 1996, or Gallagher's simple recommendation of bishop b5, knight c6, castles. This looks excellent for white. His pieces are better coordinated, rook d6 is in the air, and he's got the two bishops. So that is not really to be recommended for black. Coming back to rook d1 then, it appears that queen c6 is black's best, when white should play rook d6. This is another very common move in this line. Following Gallagher's idea, black plays queen a4, and now white plays queen c4 with the intention of trading the queens to get a better ending. Queen takes queen, bishop takes c4, Knight f5, attacking the rook. Rook d1. Bishop e6. All of this is recommended by Gallagher. Bishop takes e6. F takes e6. King e2. And now we reach a critical position. It all hinges on whose e-pawn is the weaker. In the game Ubilava Zajcic, USSR 1976, Black carelessly played rook ac8 in this position, allowing rook d7, rook f7, rook h d1, with a clear advantage for white. It seems very important for black to stop the move rook d7. Thus Gallagher gives rook f7, and he claims this position is quite okay for black, appending rook he1, h5, and he gives some further moves. The latest example that I have in this line, the game Zimmerman versus Mellegers, Dutch Team Championship 1996, shows that white is getting much the better of the game after g3. I should take you through this game because it's very instructive. The point of g3 is to take away important squares from the black knight. For instance, it's not too difficult to imagine that black might play knight h4 at some stage. Nor is it difficult to imagine a sequence where, say, black plays knight e7, hoping to put his knight back on d5, white plays rook d6, knight d5 happens, and then white simply plays bishop d4 when black hasn't got knight f4 check, and then black's pawns turn out to be quite weak. Having denied the knight squares, white can get to work building his position by doubling rooks on the d file. Certainly this plan in Zimmerman Mellegers works to perfection. Back to the game now, and black played h5 after g3. White played rook d2, and black played rook a f8. Well, white must answer that move with bishop to b4. And after bishop b4, black went rook c8. And now came rook hd1 with the thematic doubling of rooks on the d file. Black played rook c4. White rook d8 check. King h7. Bishop c3. All one can say about this position is that it hasn't changed very much over the past few moves. It all revolves around whose e-pawn is the weaker. After bishop c3, black played rook c7, and white played rook e8. Now that move forces an exchange of rooks, which is exactly what white wants. The more pieces that come off, the less easy it is for black to cause confusion, and then white can get to work on the weak black pawns. Black played rook fe7, white was happy to trade. Black played rook takes e7, and then came rook d8. Now over the next few moves, white finds a very elegant way of trying to get at black's e-pawn. Black played king g6, and then came rook c8. Black occupied the open file, but then came rook c4, and that was the idea. Suddenly, white's about to win a pawn, and black chooses the best way to jettison this pawn. He plays e3. F takes e3, knight e7, but now e4. A key move cutting black's knight out of the d5 square. That's crucial. Well, it won't be easy to exploit this extra pawn, but white does it in style. Let's see what happens. Black tried knight c6, but as you can see, he can only attack the e5 pawn with one piece. It's easy for white to defend. Meanwhile, white played b4, trying to get rid of black's knight. a6, a4, king g5, white played king e3, king g4, and now b5. A takes b5, A takes b5, and it's important to keep the knight central in this type of position, so black played knight e7 as opposed to knight a7, which would just attack the pawn. If white defended the pawn with, say, rook c5 or rook b4, white would still hold a big advantage. So knight e7 is important, centralise the knight. Now came bishop b2, knight g6, rook c2, king h3, and white pressed on with b6. And the problem is for black that he can't really use his knight on both sides of the board. What he wants to do ideally is to keep it on the king side to assist with counterplay, but he needs it on the queen side in view of white's threat of rook c7 and then penetration to the back rank. So unfortunately knight e7 is now forced. After knight e7, white played king f4, and now we see the dilemma for black's knight. White's threatening to penetrate with king g5, black can't defend against all the threats. Black played h4, best he could do. Rook came into c7. That's a must trade, so rook takes, pawn takes, and finally white has achieved the dream of any ending, a passed pawn, which as you can see completely ties down black's knight. I'm afraid black's position is lost here. He played knight c8. White went king g5, a well calculated move. H takes g3, H takes g3, king takes g3, and now king g6. The whole of this ending is played extremely well by white. King f4 was played, king takes g7, king takes e4, king f7, king d5, and now the winning move, king e8. Well, in this position black resigned. Let's just check it out and see why. If he plays king c6, white plays king d8. That forces a knight move, so let's say knight b6. I mean, black could play knight a7, doesn't matter. The winning move is easy. c8, queen, knight takes c8, king takes c8, and black soon runs into Zugzwang. For instance, b5, king d8, white just keeps going up and down until black runs out of moves. Hey presto, he's just run out of moves. That's why black resigned. Nice game by white. Back then to the position after c takes d4. Let's assume black plays knight c6 again, white plays knight f3. And there are two moves to close this section which I want to consider. According to Murray-Chandler, the most prudent move here is e6. But the problem with that move is that after knight c3, white is a tempo ahead of lines like the Panov-Botvinnik attack or the c3 Sicilian. And this proves problematic for black. Let me just give you a flavour of what might happen in this position and the type of attack white can whip up by showing you the game Anderson vs Morovic, Lucerne Olympiad 1982, and demonstrate conclusively this variation is not very good for black. Because in that game, black played queen d8, and white played the excellent move bishop c4. Then came knight f6, white castled, and black played bishop e7. So it looks very much like a standard position. It's just that white is a tempo ahead of the main lines. He's got his development together more quickly. Anderson went rook e1 in this position, and after castles played bishop g5. So it looks like a standard position, but white is way ahead. b6 was played, a3, bishop b7, and now the reason for a3, queen d3. Now that has many points. a3 prevents black's knight from coming to b4. This is very important. Meanwhile, white can build up with, for instance, rook a d1 and then bishop a2 to b1, something like that. And on top of all this, black's always got to watch out for the move d5, detonating the position at the right moment. This is why black rushed to try and block the d5 square. But unfortunately, after knight d5, bishop takes d5, bishop takes g5, bishop e4 is the move to continue the white advantage. h6 was played, rook a d1, now d5 is very much on the horizon. Black played rook e8, and then came d5. He takes d5, knight takes d5, The immediate threat, of course, in this position is to go bishop h7 check, take on e8, and go knight c7. This would be very dangerous, which explains black's next move, which looks rather odd, king f8. Anderson played queen b5. Well, black's queen's got to move, queen c8, and then came h4, which is rather embarrassing for black's bishop. Bishop went back to d8. Knight went to b4, and this move really turns the screw. After that, Morra played rook e6 and rook c1. Gives black insoluble problems. a6, queen f5, bishop e7 was played, queen h7, a crushing move, bishop takes b4, a takes b4, and in this position black took the decision to resign. There's no real defence to moves like bishop f5, after which the position of black king becomes almost untenable. That's the type of attack white can whip up with the extra tempo. The final variation I want to consider in this section sees black playing an early bishop g4. Now there are some tactical lines which are supposed to be good for white after knight c3, but some recent analysis has rendered those lines completely unclear. Thus I'm going to recommend bishop e2 to you. I think this is probably the best move that white's got. Black normally plays e6 in this position, and the critical line is reached after knight c3. In the game Alekhine versus Podgorny, Prague 1936, black played bishop to b4. White quickly got the upper hand after castles, queen a5, a3, putting pressure on black to relinquish the bishop pair. If he goes bishop takes c3, b takes c3, queen takes c3, then rook b1 really puts the heat on. If he plays as Podgorny did with knight f6, then d5 is an excellent move. The idea being that after e takes d5, Alekhine played a takes b4, and surprisingly after queen takes a1, knight d2, bishop takes e2 check, queen takes e2, white's free to pursue his initiative with the black queen right out of the game. The game went on, knight e7, rook e1, castles, knight b3, a very good move, queen a6, only move, queen takes queen, pawn takes queen, rook takes e7, and white was just winning. Black has several moves for his queen in this position, but none of them should lead to very much. For instance, in the game Filipovic versus Zakic, Yugoslavia 1995, black tried queen d6. White played h3, bishop h5, and then the key idea, knight b5. Zakic tried queen d8, but after bishop f4, rook c8, queen a4, black is in more than a spot of bother in view of white's threat of knight takes a7 on top of everything else. He tried bishop b4 check, king f1, knight ge7, but white went straight through with the move knight takes a7. After the further knight d5, knight takes c8, knight takes f4, knight a7, white was winning. Back at the ranch, after knight c3, black could play queen to d7. I believe the best method for white was demonstrated in the game Matulovic versus Trifunovic, Yugoslav Championship 1958. And let me show you what that was. White castled, very straightforward. Black played knight f6. And now the very direct move, knight e5, posed black a problem. Trifunovic went bishop takes e2. But after knight takes d7, bishop takes d1, knight takes f6 check, g takes f6, rook takes d1, white had a clearly superior endgame. Black castled on the queen side, bishop e3 happened, bishop b4, and now d5, a very good move, splitting up black's pawns. Trifunovic tried bishop takes c3, but after d takes c6, bishop takes b2, c takes b7 check, he's got a problem. He can't take that pawn back, because if king takes b7, rook d b1 is a killer. So king b8 was played, rook a b1, bishop e5, pawn to g3, bishop c7, rook dc1, and white had fantastic prospects due to the dangerous passed pawn on the 7th rank. The final move I'd like to consider in this section is possibly black's soundest move, queen a5. Certainly it requires energetic play by white to take advantage of that move. I believe the best move is an aggressive plan discovered by American Grandmaster Benjamin, where he recommends h3, bishop h5, and now the pawn sacrifice d5. Certainly recent results for white have been fantastic in this line. Well, black has to take that pawn, his hand is forced. And now white's idea is knight d4, putting black under immediate pressure. Knight takes d4 as usual, and then white plays bishop takes h5. Now the black knight is very exposed in the middle, and I'll give you a couple of examples of play from this position. In the game Benjamin versus Zsuzsa Polgar, New York, 1985, black played knight e6. White castled, knight f6 was played, and white played rook e1. Then came the move g6. Certainly not the catastrophic bishop c5 as played in Jahn versus Waffenschmidt, Baden-Baden 1998, when rook takes e6 check was an immediate clean-up. So back to g6 as played by Polgar. Bishop g4 was played, bishop g7, bishop takes e6, f takes e6, queen b3, an excellent move by white, castles, rook takes e6. Well, the upshot of it all is that white's got back his pawn and black's d pawn is very weak. So I think we can assess the position after king h8, bishop e3, as happened in the game, as clearly advantageous to white. A couple more recent examples of this interesting line. In the game Hrasech versus Georgiev, Krynitsa 1998, the moves h3, bishop h5, d5, e takes d5, knight d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes h5, knight e6, castles, knight f6, rook e1, g6, bishop g4 played. And now Georgiev played knight takes g4. This didn't help his cause very much, because after queen takes g4, bishop e7, doubtless white was threatening rook takes e6 there, bishop h6, he ended up with his king stuck in the middle, which ultimately proved fatal. Finally, in the game Zakharov versus Tunik, Smolensk in 1997, the pawn sacrifice was again essayed, but this time after knight d4, black tried bishop takes e2. This didn't turn out very well either. After queen takes e2, bishop e7, knight takes c6, b takes c6, castles. The problem for black is simply stated. His king is stuck in the middle. White can build up at leisure, and indeed he went on to win. We come now to an underrated system for black, which has been popular with several top players, notably American Grandmaster Roman Dzindzikashvili. And that is to say the move 3g6 in this position. I feel that it is possible for white to get the advantage, but he has to play very carefully. I'm going to show you two variations. In both lines, white gets the edge. The first move is the simplest. White should simply take back on d4. And then black has two moves, one of which I think is pretty lousy, the other one we'll look at later. But first of all, let's look at the move bishop g7, which I consider to be lousy. Why is this move bad? Well, I think because it cedes white complete control of the centre. It's not like a typical Sicilian dragon or Perk or modern defence, because what you've got here is a position where black has actually mistimed his attack on white's centre. With simple moves, white can build up, and black finds it very difficult to break white's attack. A typical example was the game Gambit versus Le Beau, Quebec Open 1998, a very easy game to understand. White played knight c3, black played d6, bishop came to e3, and the knight came to f6, so typical modern moves. And then white pretends he's playing a Sicilian dragon here, just plays f3. Now that prevents knight g4. Black plays knight c6, I think you'll agree that's a fairly standard move, and then white plays queen d2. And then black takes a look around this position and he probably says to himself, well, where is my counterplay coming from? I could play e5. Well, that's not such a bad move, but with a simple knight g2, I think white must have at least a slight advantage. That pawn on d6 is looking very sickly. But that might even be black's best move in this position. If black castles, well, as he did a bit later on in this game, then he risks going down to direct attack after a move such as h4, or maybe g4 first. In fact, this is similar to what Gambit does, so I won't really give the game away. And Le Beau, well, after much thought probably, came out with the move a6. Okay, natural enough move, but what does it do? How does it combat white's big centre? Well, as the game goes on, black fails to find any counterplay whatsoever. Perhaps that is the drawback of this system. It's difficult to find good counterplay moves in this position. Okay, knight g2 was played by white, and black plays bishop d7. I think he thinks he's playing the dragon or something. And now came bishop h6. Now, having made moves like a6, it's going to be difficult for black to entertain castling on the queen side, particularly as he's mistimed the capture c takes d4, and white would also have the open c file to work with if black's king went long. So black castled short. However, this enabled white to create a direct attack with the move h4. And the rest of this game is actually quite entertaining. Black played b5, and white went straight for the jugular with h5. Well, of course, this is based on the typical tactic: knight takes h5, rook takes h5, g takes h5, queen g5, and that is literally the end. So black, seeing the Holocaust coming up, played e6, trying to get his queen over to the defence of his king, but white wasn't having any of that at all. He just ploughed straight on with the move g4. Black played rook c8. Well, you see, normally in the Yugoslav attack of the dragon or something, white's king will be on c1 at this point. Another plus point is that black can make random moves on the queen side like b5 and rook c8, but really there's nothing to attack there. So white is just getting on with it. Black is floundering, trying to find counterplay. White played rook d1, and black played queen a5. Perhaps this is the losing move even, because the black queen drifts away from the defence of his king, and white just puts the boot in now. Bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and now queen f4, threatening the deadly h6 check, which would just win the game. Well, black played knight g8. Probably couldn't see anything better than that, but of course the downside to that is that queen takes d6 is now virtually a winning move. Black's position is already in complete disarray, and please note that white's queen can also go backwards to h2. So black is lost in this position. He tried b4. White went h takes g6. Very strong move. B takes c3. And white just played the very calm move b takes c3 here, leaving black in total disarray. F takes g6 was played. Queen takes d7 check. Knight c7. Queen takes e6. And the rest of the game is very easy to understand. Rook takes c3 was played. Last desperate lunge. Knight takes c3. Queen takes c3 check. Rook d2. Queen takes f3. And now queen e5 check was the final move of the game. Black doesn't have a single move at his disposal. If he plays king f7, h7 hangs. If he blocks on f6 with the knight, e7 hangs. If he blocks on f6 with the rook, then I think the simplest move is just g5. So that was a very convincing win by white. Of course, black can probably play slightly better than that, but you get the general idea of the variation. Put simply, bishop g7 on move 4 just gives white total control of the game. Returning to the position after g6, c takes d4, black's best move here is undoubtedly d5. And what black's hoping to set up here is a kind of favourable Caracan formation or French formation, where, for instance, if he gets rid of his bishop on c8 at the right moment, then he can hope to pressurise white's pawns. Let me just show you how black's system might work if white played inaccurately. Let's say white played e5 in this position, and black played knight c6. White plays the inaccurate move, knight f3. Then comes bishop g4. Bishop comes to e2. Black brings his knight out to h6. All these moves come before bishop g7, note. White castles. Black whips off the knight on f3. Bishop takes f3 and then knight round to f5. And now black is more or less achieving his ideal position. As you can see, after e6 and queen b6, the pressure's piling up on d4. Black's got lots of good pieces. This is the ideal position in this line that black wants to achieve, and we must fight against that. Back now to the position after 4d5, and I'm going to recommend the move e5 to you, despite the previous debacle where white got into all sorts of trouble. And we'll look at the game Zagorskis versus Carlsen, Copenhagen Open 1998, which provides us with an exemplary demonstration of how to treat this position by white. Zagorskis, of course, strong 2500 player. Black played knight c6, and now the first important moment. White played knight c3 in this position. The whole point of white's play in this game is to deny the bishop on c8 a good square. If white can delay the entry of his knight on g1 into the game and deny that bishop a good square, he does tend to get the better position against this line. Carlsen went knight h6, doubtless hoping for knight f3 when he could go bishop g4. But Zagorskis played g3 in this position, and I think that's a very good move. The idea is that after bishop g7, bishop g2, castles, I think white's intention is not actually to take that d pawn, for instance with knight takes d5, when e6 will get the pawn back straight away, but instead to continue to play thematically with the move knight ge2. And as you can see, it's quite difficult for that bishop now, because if the bishop comes out to f5, it's actually taking away the best square from that knight. And if it comes out to g4, as it did in the game, then white plays very simply f3, bishop has to run away, and then bishop e3. Now, black's position might look okay, but in fact, these three pieces, the knight on h6, the bishop on g7 and the bishop on e6, are slightly clumsy, and white's position is much easier to organise. So I assess this is a clear advantage for white already because of that. And as the game goes, Carlsen drifts into a worse and worse position. He tried queen b6, which I think you'll agree looks a good move. Got two threats, queen takes b2 and also knight takes e5. So white's next move is all but forced. Queen d2. Then came knight f5, so fair enough, he seems to be doing the right things, and the bishop just drops back to f2. Now black plays f6, so it must be said that black is trying his level best to get his pieces into the game. g4, another very interesting move, sending black's knight back to Coventry. So back goes the knight, white plays knight f4, another very, very good move here. And black's got a problem. If he goes bishop f7, we can see that his pieces are tripping over each other's toes. Possibly the best move here for white is just e6, and then d5 hangs. What can black do in this position? Carlsen played knight a5. But the problem with that move is now I think white can actually take the d-pawn. And he did. Knight c takes d5. Well, black was probably relieved to get rid of that very bad piece, even at the cost of a pawn. So knight takes d5. Black went queen d8. And knight f4 was played again. Now, it's very difficult to believe in black's position here, with his knights on the edge of the board like that. And, well, black decided to sacrifice the exchange in this position. If you look at his position, it is incredibly difficult to find a good move. White's already threatening knight e6. The next move smacks of desperation then, and f takes e5 was played. Really, black can't hope to have any compensation for the exchange in this position. Knight e6 was played. Queen d5. Now, a very cunning move by Zagorski. He doesn't take on f8. He plays knight c7. Queen went back to f7. And then queen takes a5. I think white found the nicest way to do this. Should be lost for black now. Rook a c8 was played. White castled. Black's just fishing around for tricks. b6 was played. Queen takes a7. White's just mopping up now. e6. Rook a c1. E takes d4. Queen takes b6. And in this position black could have resigned. I'll just show you the last few horrible moves from black's point of view. Bishop e5 was played. Desperation. Queen takes e6 was the excellent reply. Bishop takes c7 was played. Queen takes f7 check. Knight takes f7. Bishop takes d4. Of course, white is 3 pawns up in this position. Knight g5. f4. Finally opening up the bishop. Rook fd8. Bishop f6. And at long last, black decided to resign. I think the method that Zagorski used in this game is very effective, and I can heartily recommend it to you as the best way of countering g6. The variation I want to consider now is 3d3. Frankly, I don't particularly think this is a very good move because it gives white all the play in the centre, but I think a lot of your opponents are going to do this. They're simply going to be petrified of accepting that gambit pawn and just push the pawn on the hope that will disrupt you. Well, in my opinion, in this variation white gets a good game very comfortably. The best move for white here is c4. White could play bishop takes d3 first and then c4. The ideas are interchangeable, because after knight c6 white will play bishop takes d3 anyway. What are the ideas for white in this position? Well, by and large, white hopes to build up in the following manner. He'll bring his knight out to f3 usually, the other knight comes to c3, and then he'll play the move h3. This gives white a big grip on the centre. Now, in this type of position, white can build up in comfortable fashion. He usually castles on the king side. The bishop comes out either to e3 or maybe g5, and it's usually backed up with the queen, and as you can see it's very comfortable. White can bring his rooks to the middle. Maybe he'll play them to c1 and d1 like that, possibly to d1 and e1. At any rate, it's easy for white to develop his pieces to good squares in this line. That's why I don't really like it for black. Let's see some examples where white enacts this plan, puts it into practice. The flavour of this variation can be seen in the game Maric versus Ivkov, Yugoslavia 1956. It's an old reference but very relevant. White played c4 and black just played natural developing moves in typical Sicilian accelerated dragon style. Bishop takes d3, black played knight f6, white played knight c3, and now g6 was played. Obviously black can adopt other Sicilian setups, but white's idea is the same. He grips the centre with those pawns on c4 and e4 in Morocci bind style. Alright, after g6, white brought his knight out to f3 and black played d6. And now a very important move for white, securing a slight advantage at least, h3. I think we can say when black is threatening to go bishop g4, I mean let's say white carelessly castled here and black played bishop g4. There you can see black has control of the key squares d4 and e5. I mean all things considered it's best for white not to allow that plan. Thus h3 is safest and best, securing a slight advantage. Well, in this game Maric versus Ivkov, black played bishop g7, white castled, all very easy moves to play. And now a cunning move by black, knight d7, just when you're expecting him to castle. Now, I would say it depends on your style here, but for my own part, I wouldn't like to allow black to play bishop takes c3. The reason being that this particular pawn structure is pretty bad for the bishops. The bishops don't operate well with this pawn structure, and black has nice squares for his pieces here. For instance, you could just see black setting up this position and pressurising white's pawns. And this is why, if we just go back, Maric played a very careful move in this position after knight d7. He played knight d5. I suppose white could also play bishop d2 here. That would also give him a slight edge, but of course it would expose the bishop to knight c5. But knight d5 is a very good move, I think, because it's a square very powerful in the centre of the board, puts pressure on black's position. If black ever tries to kick the knight with e6, then the d6 pawn is very weak. So, all things considered, I think knight d5 is a very good move. Ivkov castled, white played rook b1, knight de5 was the move, and white took this off. Black took back with the pawn. That's an interesting move. Black wants to use the d4 square. If he took back with the knight, then I think the simple move bishop e2 gives white a clear advantage. f4 will increase that advantage, followed by, for instance, bishop e3 and queen d2 with a very nice build-up and extra space. Thus d takes e5, hoping to use the d4 square, but after b4, bishop e6, bishop e3, knight d4, f4, white had the initiative and was at least slightly better. I would much prefer to play white. Moving up to speed, here's another example, a very modern example of the prospectless 3d3. This is the game Lenoir versus Habibi, Vienna Open 1994, where white plays c4 and black set up the same sort of fianchetto system that we saw in the last game. g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and here Lenoir plays knight f3, allowing black the chance to take on c3. Well, you may or may not like to do that, depends on your style. Lenoir obviously didn't think it was that serious. Black played d6, and white now played h3 in view of black's threat of bishop g4. Knight f6 happened, castles, and now white has to choose between bishop e3 and the move Lenoir played, bishop g5. Generally it's very easy for white to position his pieces on good squares in this line. Knight d7 was the move by black, queen d2, and the knight came to c5. White played rook a c1, bishop e6, This is all typical play in this line. b3 protecting the pawn. Black played a5 to try and secure his knight. And now the key move, knight d5, ensuring white at least a slight advantage. It's those two pawns on c4 and e4 cramping black in the centre, the typical Morroxy bind position, and that very strong knight on d5, which gives white the edge. Observe that if black were ever to take that knight on d5, then I think white will capture back with the e pawn, exposing the pawn on e7 to attack. White's got an easy plan here, just rook e1 and then pile up on that weak pawn. All things considered, I can't really recommend the move d3 to black. It seems too easy for white to get at least a slight advantage with very natural moves, as long as you remember to play c4. We'll tie up the video now with a couple of very rare third moves by black. And the first of these is queen to a5. Well, if you're playing your granny at 95 years old, this is quite a good move. But against any normal player, it's equivalent to suicide. In my opinion, white should just play knight f3 and offer the Morra Gambit. That queen is ridiculous on a5. It's been brought far too early into the game. Let me just show you how silly black's position is after that queen move. Let's assume black plays knight f6 in this position. Well, white plays e5. And in the game Gick versus Hodos, USSR 1965, black cleverly, or so he thought, took the pawn on c3. Knight takes c3. Knight went to e4. And now white played a very good move, bishop f4. Knight takes c3, queen d2. That was the point of bishop f4. Knight c6, and then b takes c3. Well, it looks like a normal position. The only piece which isn't very normal is the queen on a5. You'd be hard pressed to find a good reason why black should have his queen out on a5 so early. Must be clear advantage to white this position. White will follow up with bishop c4, castles and rooks to the middle, when he's ideally placed for the middle game. Now let's assume you are playing your granny, and on top of being senile enough to play this variation in the first place, she's also rather greedy. What happens if black takes this pawn on c3? Knight takes c3. Now amazingly, this was actually played by a grandmaster in the game Rosenblatt versus Forintos, Hungary 1956, so granny's in good company here. Black played knight f6 and white played bishop d2. Knight came out to c6 and then bishop c4 gave white a hyper-accelerated version of the Morra Gambit. After queen e2, castles, rook d1 and rook ac1, black was in dire straits. The queen proved to be misplaced completely on a5. Another mad move in this position is 3e5. If I can draw an analogy, just to drop back, it's not at all like the position after e4, c5, c3, e5. Because there, after d4, black wouldn't necessarily capture on d4. Instead, with the Morra move order, the immediate capture on d4 has given white the easy option after e5 of just taking back. And this, in view of black's weak backward pawn, should secure at least a slight advantage for white. For instance, if e takes d4 by black, knight f3 is the simplest, with at least a slight advantage to white. We've reached the end of our investigation into the Morra Gambit. Chess these days has become a very practical game, very opportunist. If it works, play it, worry about the objective merits later, and if it doesn't work, drop it like a stone. Well, I would very much encourage you to try out the Morra Gambit. As an aggressive point-scoring weapon against the Sicilian defence, it really is second to none.